Hey everyone. Last week I read an article in the Wall Street Journal that basically suggested that demand for apartments has declined because apartment rents are too high. Now, I won't get into the inner workings of economic theory here, but that position isn't in alignment with how most economists think. What did happen though is household formation went down significantly last year. The question is why? A drop in household formation impacts many property types, not just apartments. It impacts retail space demand, and it has a knock-on effect on industrial space demand. Why did household formation slow down? Yes, rising rents and home prices were probably a factor, but I believe another thing was the true cause. Consumer sentiment fell to a record low. The University of Michigan Consumer Sentiment Index should not be confused with the Conference Board Consumer Confidence Index. Although consumer sentiment and consumer confidence sound alike, they're not the same thing. Consumer confidence focuses more on employment conditions, while consumer sentiment focuses more on personal finances. So in the current climate, these two measurements of the consumer perspective diverge a little bit. The job market is really strong, so consumer confidence is holding up pretty well. On the other hand, consumer sentiment is much more in tune with personal financial conditions and things like inflation. And looking back historically, there's a pretty strong correlation between consumer sentiment and household formation. There's also a strong inverse correlation between consumer sentiment and inflation. So when inflation goes up, consumer sentiment tends to fall, and it takes household formation down with it. The good news is that in recent months, inflation has begun to abate, and as a result, consumer sentiment has begun to rise again. The reason I think this is important is because a lot of people are saying that housing demand is down because it's too expensive. And while the cost of housing is certainly a factor, I think the more important driver right now is that people are concerned about inflation and recession risk. When people are worried about their finances, they're less likely to go out and rent a new apartment or buy a new house. They're also less likely to go buy furniture or electronics or even discretionary apparel. In addition, reduced household formation will weigh on housing construction and the sale of building materials. So while consumer sentiment more directly impacts apartment demand, it also bleeds through other types of commercial real estate. The good news for the commercial real estate sector is that consumer sentiment appears to have reached its trough last June, which is when inflation peaked. Since then, it has risen by 17 points from a rating of 50 to 67. I think that consumer sentiment will need to climb back into the 80s before it begins to meaningfully boost household formation. But the trend is now going in the right direction. Looking forward, there are three primary factors that will significantly influence consumer sentiment. The first is inflation. Inflation needs to continue to make progress toward the ultimate goal of reaching 2%. Second, the Federal Reserve needs to constrain rate hikes to just 4 25 basis point increases in 2023. And third, the US economy needs to get past the recession risk and the uncertainty it creates. If those three factors align, then sentiment should gain ground pretty quickly. Assuming nothing goes horribly wrong and these pieces fall into place, then demand for apartments, retail space, and industrial space should gain momentum. Thinking long term, I believe a revival is inevitable at some point. Maybe in the second half of 2023 or maybe in 2024. It's really just a matter of when the forces align. For investors who are thinking forward, there could be opportunities to get a step ahead of the competition who are locked in on the current news cycle and they're waiting on the sidelines. I've seen it many times. The investors who take action and lock in the best opportunities are often the ones who kept their eyes on the horizon.